Welcome to the Redacted Culture Cast. This is the exciting 100th episode of this show that we've been putting on that seeks to answer and engage with some of the harder questions in regards to how we think about violence, how do we think about culture, how do we think about, well, some of the topics that today's guest has written about and has had no shortage of mention for those who have listened for a while. Jack, you've been an influence in my life through your writing, and that is just from one man to another. Thank you for what you've done. But would you introduce yourself?
Oh yeah, my name is Jack Donovan, and I've been writing about masculinity and associated topics for probably 15 years, but at least 10. And my book, The Way of Men, has been obviously published around the world, and sold a few 100,000 copies, and it's been pretty influential, I think, over the years. So that's basically me in a nutshell. And I've written obviously a few other books, Becoming a Barbarian, More Complete Beast, which just came out in Italy yesterday, and then my most recent book, Fire in the Dark.
Yeah, so I have read your gamut, at least of those four, and I've got them here. But congratulations on getting it another one published in another country. I don't know what that's like, and I look forward to finding out one day.
It's fun. Well, I don't actually worry about making any money from it. It's just kind of a feather in your cap, because I can't market a book in a foreign language, right? Like, how am I going to do that? So, some company, and I won't look at them too hard, and they'll come to me and be like, "Hey, we'd like to publish your book and translate it and do all that and market it." And I was like, okay, just give me some nominal amount of money and send me 10 books, and cool. Now my book is published in another language, but it's cool. I have a whole bookshelf full of like all these translations, and it's nice to have.
Have you been, how many times have you been asked to tell your origin story, or is that even relevant anymore?
I mean, I guess it's always relevant, but I mean, I can do that if you'd like.
The very specific question I'm curious is what where you're at now. How did your perspective change from when you started writing and publishing, however many years ago, to like, was there a moment where you said, okay, now this is happening, I'm going, or was that a slow process?
What do you mean from when I started writing and publishing, or earlier than that?
Well, even it can be before that, because
Yeah.
in some ways it seems like The Way of Men was a big flashpoint, but that's not when you started writing it. It wasn't publishing it. I mean, publishing it is one thing, but starting to write it is another. And how did that come to pass? And
Right.
what were you engaging with at the time?
Right. I had written another book before that where I kind of talked about masculinity in a positive way. And then one of the criticisms of that book was that I didn't define masculinity very well. And then I looked around and tried to do better with that, and found out that no one really does define it very well. And so then that became my project, and that's how The Way of Men happened. And at the time, now we have your Jockos and your Jordan Petersons and all these people talking about masculinity, and there's male coaches everywhere, and there's this whole space. But you mentioned Brett McKay in the original, in the pre-funk there, and I mean, at that time there was Art of Manliness and a bunch of like MRA blogs and pickup artists and stuff like that who were talking about it, and then no really mainstream figures were talking about how masculinity, that they didn't really see that there was a problem yet. Like, guys who were actually masculine were like, we don't talk about that, we're men. We're getting and so it was almost looked at as kind of weird and problematic to bring it out. But like, I think I tapped into a need right before it happened, and so like that's the reason why The Way of Men took off, I think, is because I tapped into the zeitgeist. There was a question sitting out there, and I put out an answer for it before really a lot of other people got into it.
Yeah, there's that phrase or quote, "Woe to the world when a man comes in his time, or comes into being in his time." I know I'm completely butchering it, but there's just this idea of like, sometimes people, like in the sense of Napoleon, build their ship right at the right time. And so the question of masculinity has been a long, I think, because I'm 30, I'm in my 30s. I was born in the 90s, barely. And I grew up in an environment where I got to look up to my father as a positive masculine figure
Mhm.
in a small town environment where let's just call it the encroaching anti-masculine environment came through very subversive methods, oftentimes in youth pastors and small environments like that, small influences like that, which really weren't small. But it wasn't like the zeitgeist so much as it was this attitude of like almost feminine managerial attitudes where boys couldn't be boys because that's bad. There was no toxic masculinity. There was no there was none of this kind of stuff. But I remember in high school and college, like pre-military, when I was in college at a young age, like the topic du jour of the day was how like advertisement takes advantage of sexualizing women. And then by the time I'm out of the military, there's an entirely different world. And so
Right.
the subject of masculinity is an interesting one because I relate that subject on how it hasn't been. There was a time before it was talked about. Now we do have more to the same concept with violence. It's like it's a bit of a what's the word? Not status quo, not faux pas. It's a little bit of a thing you don't talk about. We
Okay.
don't talk about violence because it seems to be like it's just a necessary evil, and like that's not a really good explanation of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me give you a little bit of background, actually, because I listened to that and you say when you were born, and I was already out of college, and um, a lot of this has been cooking for a long time. I actually went to school in New York City in the early '90s, and so they went at an art school, and it was actually a division of the New School for Social Research. So there were actually people there studying cultural studies at that point, which would now be woke studies, basically. But it was then called cultural studies, and it was about all the oppressed populations and all the things that you hear in mainstream society now. They were doing that then, and all the gender stuff that you're hearing now, they were doing that then. The queer theory and all the things that are underlying all that stuff was all there, and it was new and exciting, at that point. Like they were like, what if we challenge this, what if we challenge that? And it was all like this very like subversive thing. And then it just slowly marinated up through, those people then got teaching jobs, then it moved up through the system. And I think that was one of the reasons why I was able to see some stuff before other people, because for a lot of people it just came out of the blue. Like, where does this toxic masculinity come from? And if you really look at the history of it, in the 70s they used to call it testosterone poisoning.
Okay.
It's the same language. Like Alan Alda used to say like testosterone poisoning and stuff like that. So it's been part of feminism, and it's been this growing thing for a long time. It just had to do whatever they call the long march through the universities or whatever to get to the point where like now it's like you have all these men who are realizing, oh my God, this is happening everywhere. This is a big problem. Whereas like, I got to see kind of firsthand early on, like here's where it's going,
So for those men, whether they're younger or older, it seems like I observe this pattern that happens where it goes from ignorance of the event, of the growing zeitgeist of sorts. Because I do have two questions about this, but the first one is this: it starts from ignorance or naivety towards the zeitgeist to basically straight to nihilism. There's this big jump from sort of going about in the world, figuring out what you're doing, to like, oh my gosh, the academies are corrupt. They're captured institutions that are all driven towards anti-masculine and blah blah blah. And you just build the list of grievances, and then they go straight from there to like black-pilled nihilism. And I've seen that consistent, and that was something that I didn't find in your writing, which I can say to a small extent I was kind of looking for it, and I didn't find it.
Yeah, I mean, post 2020, it's a little harder to be optimistic, I think. But Yeah, I mean, you have to be, right? I mean, you have to do. One of the guys in my group said he's an apocalyptimist. We were talking about raising children, or whatever, and he's like, well, if you're going to be a parent, you have to be an apocalyptimist. And I just thought that was funny language, but
Very articulate, very well done.
yeah, something.
Yeah.
It's been nice.
Is that a
way to
50
go.
cent
That guy's
word?
actually like a SWAT cop, but
Good for him.
yeah.
Mhm.
But so I thought that was really good. But I mean, obviously, you want to try and work towards making things okay. And making things the way they should be, or writing the world in whatever way that you think they should be. Because if you don't, the black pill thing, it's like it became very popular. The whole Kali Yuga thing that goes through those circles of the idea that we're in a fallen age, and then so we're basically doomed to live in this fallen age, and then so that kind of absolves you of responsibility for taking action to change it.
Absolutely, yeah. I see this very often with the statement that people make in regards to strong men create good times create weak men, and this Strauss-Howe generational theory. And
Mhm.
it's not that the theory itself could be understood as descriptive, as in like there's a descriptive pattern in human history, but it's
Mhm.
almost like it's prescriptive, like, oh, well, therefore I don't need to do anything. It's
Right.
almost, and that's the part that I find strange, and that's where I'm actually, because in the pre-show I was kind of bringing up some of the points. I wanted to jump ahead
Okay.
to one of your books, because I don't think Becoming a Barbarian is um I think the title is very like shocking, and for good reason. But you have this concept in that one talking about the empire of nothing and something rising from its body. Did I describe that correctly?
Sure.
Would you
Yeah.
before that's where I want to go, because I have some I have some questions, and I wanted to engage in that one. But there's this idea, and this is a short, perhaps even yes or no question, is I see this in the culture war conversation, whether it's like Tim Pool and Jack Posobiec, or it's Tim Pool, Jack Posobiec, and James Lindsay, and even some sense Jordan Peterson, who mention the long march through the institutions. And those four characters, or as if those were four examples of characters, spend a lot of time debating amongst one another whether this woke ideology came from the institutions, or came from technology, or came from something else. And you just said that you saw it 20 years ago, 30 years ago,
Yeah.
and so it's nothing new to you. What
Right.
is do you is that a debate and negotiation worth engaging with on where this thing came from, or is it more important to address the subject and correct it?
Well, I mean, it is important to understand ideas. I mean, honestly, James Lindsay, I wrote about the Empire of Nothing, and then a lot of things that I said in Becoming a Barbarian, uh, James Lindsay totally independently makes very much more articulate. And so I've become a fan of his work, actually, like, and because he describes certain mindsets that they've been adopting in a very articulate way. And so I think he's a really useful figure. Uh, but also then the next step, there's identifying the problem, which, let's say, I don't like right and left. I think it's very 20th century, but whatever the right and the left is right now. The right's very good at identifying the problem now. They're good at identifying problems, but not with envisioning a future.
Yes,
And so,
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
And so, like, where do we go? Like that, where do we go is the next thing. And it's maybe not one like, because there are a lot of people with a lot of different ideas, like, where people have to come up with positive visions for the future, instead of just saying, like, okay, yes, it's funny that they believe this stupid thing, ha ha ha. I mean, that's a lot of like what conservative commentary is, right? And so, can we get past that? And yes, they believe this crazy thing, but okay, what do you believe that's better, and how are we going to get there? I think,
Exactly.
yeah.
Very easy case in point example of that would be it's June, right? So Pride Month.
Right.
Okay, Pride Month, and then I found, like, I like, as a Christian, I was in some sense shameful that it took non-Christians to identify this theological structure being the LGBTQ thing as it's presented as a religion. I was like, where was BB Warfield when this was going on? Or where were these characters? I mean, BB Warfield's been dead for 100 years, but it was so like, but even in a cultural sense, the right will say, "Oh, Pride Month is invasive, and it's this ridiculous holiday that we've injected into everything." And the question is like, when was the last time that you would call the right, and we're using these sort of loose terms, came up with a holiday that was valid, that people were like, yes, I'm going to celebrate that? And the answer is, I can't think of one.
Yeah, no, neither can I mean, they would have been, probably, I don't know, probably things like, I'm like, is there stuff associated with the Vietnam War, or like, it would have been about then, like that could have still happened.
Yeah, but I mean, like we recognize D-Day, but is that
Yeah.
a right-wing thing? Not really, but we
Not
recognize
really, but it assumes that we are all one people, and that it's a nationalistic thing. And the move has been away from nationalistic things into like victim culture and anti-nationalistic things. So that's the big, I think, shift.
So when you talk about anti-nationalistic things, is this what you were referring to when you're talking about the Empire of Nothing?
Yeah, I mean, it's much broader than that, because it becomes like a lack of identity completely. I mean,
Yes.
because like in the sense of like, you're not really supposed to have a race or a religion or a gender, or anything. Ideally, you're supposed to be kind of just this malleable, member of the Borg that can accept new viewpoints with whatever needs to happen. Because I always use the like plankton as a like that's kind of what they want you to be.
Okay, because I've seen it in my criticisms of multiculturalism is it reduces all the meaningful attributes that contribute to who you are to mere fashion statements. So your faith is just a fashion statement that you can you can put on and put off as you go. It has no meaningful conviction in your life. And
I mean, think about the way that they perceive like Muslims. The way that like Muslims are just like us. They totally believe in LGBTQ rights, and like like they'll paint them as like, yes, these super like urban, basically detoothed version of this religion. It is just like you. And so it's just like like you said, like a fashion statement, like, oh well, they wear a different hat, but they're just like you.
Yeah, so I can't.
And then, but if you were really to take Islam really seriously, then like that one town that actually just perfect recent example, the town that was like, now we're totally Muslim, and we're not going to have that.
Exactly. So I was living in Minneapolis,
Right.
or well, living between Minneapolis and overseas when I was working in private contracting after the military, and so I was going back and forth between the United States and overseas kind of stuff. This is during the time of ISIS, when ISIS was on the rise. And the school, when I was living in Minneapolis, there's a school that I would drive past a couple times a week. And that school was identified on the news as one of the first places that recruited an American ISIS agent to fly over to the Middle East to join ISIS. And so this is in Minneapolis, and it's just the kind of ridiculous arrogance that would say all Muslims are the same. And it's like, what there's this is what I see in that attitude, is because like I've met Muslims that this is not gonna stay PG-13 for long. I've killed people who are Muslims. I've respected them. I've looked up to them in an honorable way. I've debated them, and I've had all these different types of people. And so just to like blanket state Muslims as a person who prays loudly a couple times a day and does it in a different language than you is frighteningly shallow. But that's the level of articulation that said conversation is engaged in.
Absolutely. Well, they do the same thing with masculinity. They always say that it's outmoded. And I'm like, what kind of world do you live in where masculinity is a fashion statement? Like it's just it's out of style now. You can't be mad because it's out of style. Like that's a very feminine worldview, isn't it?
It is It is. I'm a little. Before I completely commit. I'll keep my finger on the chess piece for a second.
Uh,
I will at least say that it's a very anti-masculine sort of anti. And it's no, it's a very non-committal attitude. It's very cowardly, is what I describe it. Not feminine.
yeah, yeah,
You're refusing to take the step of committing to anything of meaning. Say it's either good or evil. Stop sitting in the middle
yeah,
and trying to ride both sides of the fence.
yeah, yeah.
So, um, I regret, or I admit that, like, whatever it is that is considered feminine,
Yeah.
outside of observing it and spending time with my wife, I don't put much thought into it. Really, I think that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't think that one really needs to. People always ask me. That's like the trick question that I always get. Like what are the feminine virtues? Like if I should write that, like what's the opposite of? And I don't think it's really like a 1-to-1 in the same that you would do it the same way. I just mean in the terms of like gossiping about fashion, which is what that was the
It's
in a negative way, not in a positive feminine way, but in a like the bad qualities of women kind of way.
Yeah, like all in our current culture, it appears like all the positive traits in men are condemned, and all the negative traits that are commonly found in women are praised, and that's
Exactly.
it's
Yeah.
just like, and you could probably spend a little bit too much time being in the right of saying in the right wing circle of just looking for all the ways that it's portrayed terribly, and not everyone is going down that road of praising the worst traits in women. It's just I don't
Right,
get
right.
that.
No, it's just in the way that like there's reality, the reality on the street, and then there's the reality that you see when you like turn on television, which is different.
Yes.
Like the worst would be like maybe like The View, or like something like that. But like that's not how all women are.
Yeah, I'll see myself out. I
Yeah.
wonder. But so I need to go back. I want to go back to this subject on the Empire of Nothing. The thing that I took from that, and the thing that I took from that is that you may look at the world out there as one thing that the Empire of Nothing looks like is that not only is it this very formless, amalgamous, perhaps even opaque mush. But that is what rot looks like, and rot is the place where new life can be born. And so I grew up in the era where, and in some ways we both did, but I grew up very much so in a milieu that complained frequently about the decline of the West, the decline of America. Men are under attack. The church is under attack. There's no Christian values anymore. And the surprising thing was that so very rarely was the complaint followed through with a call to action that was something deeper than a marketing claim and more valuable than read my other book, I guess. So what is this when you're talking why are you talking about the Empire of Nothing, and what was it, when you go back to becoming a barbarian? There is some impetus there. There's some moral impetus or direction being placed. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
What do you mean that I was placing at the time?
Yeah, I want to say that, or I'm also because I took a lot from this book.
Okay.
I took a lot more from it than I think. I found the Way of Men very descriptive and
Mhm.
very like, okay, I'm understanding a description of things, whereas I read Becoming a Barbarian much more as an imperative of
Interesting. Okay.
there is the state of the world is like this. Therefore,
Right.
you're not exactly providing you. I found it a much more of a driving force as opposed to a descriptive force, because in some ways I thought of it as, well, you can complain about the Empire of Nothing, or you can build your small empire within it,
Right.
and that leads to the Way of Men is the way of the gang. Go build your own gang. Stop waiting for people to give you permission. These attitudes that kind of pulled out of that one. How did you come to that? How did you formulate that idea? Where did this come from?
Well, I mean, it followed directly from the Way of Men. I mean, the Way of Men is the way of the gang. Um, this is a road of poor choices that I went down at the time was part of that book. But I mean, okay, the Way of Men is the way of the gang. Okay, well, I guess I should join a gang. I guess I should start a gang or join a gang. And so, like, a lot of what is in becoming a barbarian, and this doesn't make it wrong, because then I go back and look at it, I'm like, well, yeah, that's correct. But a lot of it was me arguing with myself in a sense of like, well, what elements of your own individuality do you give away when you join a group? Because sometimes the group says things that you don't agree with, and what are you, like, how do you absorb that? And you do have to give up some of your independence. And Americans are very, very married to their independence. But if you're part of a group, and I think really guys like yourself who are members of the various communities, I mean, there's certain things that you don't say, or that you're not supposed to say that your other members of that community would not approve of, depending on what group it is and whatever. If you want to remain part of that team, or that larger association, then there's certain things you don't say, and you don't say them in a certain way. And that happens with any group that you join. I mean, if you're in a church, you're like, there's certain things that are like, that puts you outside of the church, like that's no longer acceptable. Right.
Yeah. Well,
And
or
so,
in gun culture right now, the very easy answer is, if you were to, one thing that you don't get to say,
Mhm.
or you shouldn't say, or puts you on the outs is, well, these things are reserved for those people. Only military veterans should be allowed to own AR-15s, or that's a very simplistic version of it. You want to get more detailed in it. It's like, well, only combat veterans know how to shoot. It's like, I don't think anyone really believes it, but that is something that would, get you canceled in a joke, but or find you on the outside of the gang.
well, yeah, that's a lot of money that goes into training those other guys. There's a
It's
lot of interest there.
But it also is in contradiction to the values of the culture at the time, and the culture of the values of gun culture right now are very much so focused on the rights of the individual, based on them being an individual, as opposed to them being trained in a certain way. Oh, you have military training, therefore you can have a thing. We don't think that way. We think, no, you're a human being, own a firearm,
Right.
learn how to use it. You shouldn't be prohibited from learning something on the basis of you not being a government employee.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So basically, anytime you join a group, there are some things that you have to sign off on, like, and agree to, and whatever. And so that was that was part of that book, is me having that discussion with myself, and also, like, talking to other people who are having that discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And but it is very much, you have to start something, like actually, and that's obviously been a thing since the Way of Men, the whole start the world, that became my handle that I use for everything. And it's just what a Peter Fonda quote that I picked up ages ago. But it really is necessary, rather than, the people who are kind of constantly criticizing things, as we were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Well, create an alternative. Like, in the sense that conservatives do, like, are always complaining about Hollywood. Well, maybe you should start making movies. Be like, like, that's kind of like, if they're, you can't make them make culture that they don't want to make. Like, you have to create culture. You have to create the culture that, be the change you want to see in the world. You have to actually make things. And so becoming a barbarian very much was like, if you're going to go outside and do things that are unapproved, I think is the basic thesis of the book. If you're going to go out and do things that are unapproved by mainstream society, they're going to call you names, and they're going to say mean things about you, and you're going to be an outsider. But in theory, if you're doing what you believe is right, you're doing what you believe, the group that you've signed up to actually report to, and be accountable to, if you're doing what they agree is right, then, who cares what these other people say? Like, you have to be willing to have those people talk about you in a bad way, because they will. I've certainly had a good bit of that in my life. Like, okay, well, they're going to call you this name and that name and whatever thing. I actually really enjoyed. I've always been kind of cranky about my Wikipedia, which was written by lesbian communists in Boston. But like, I know exactly who fucking wrote it. But we argued it out until she finally banned me from Wikipedia. But
Aw.
yeah, and then
have you received like a Vice hit piece yet?
I narrowly have avoided Vice by the hair of chin a few times, but they've prowled around for me a bit. But I'm not like on the list right now, so I think I'm good. Actually, a piece of Mother Jones came out about the manosphere the other day, and I was low key a little jealous that I wasn't in it, but also very glad that I wasn't in it. Like, I've been in the room with everybody who you mentioned.
Yeah. Oh, I'm not cool enough for you now. This is dumb.
But it's cool because they always say the same thing, and they just kind of use me as a weird wedge figure.
Sure.
But it's a little interesting strategy they've had for a while. But anyway, anyway, what I was saying is that I was always kind of butthurt about the Wikipedia thing, but I heard James Lindsay. No, not James Lindsay. Sorry, James O'Keefe. Go on, I think Tim Pool one time, and he was complaining about his Wikipedia, and saying, oh, it's just a butcher job and whatever. And I was like, wow, if his is bad and he has a lot more money than I do to fix it, I feel kind of okay with it. Like, I was like, all right, I guess I'm in good company with that. So I'll just let it be as terrible as it is.
Yeah, it is. I think as we've seen the proliferation of information, this is going to be an epistemological argument, more or less a statement, but it's that as we've seen access to information expand, as well as different avenues of people producing information or producing content, there has become a resurgence in being very particular about what you do care about and what you don't care about. Like, when it comes to media consumption, we don't just all get along. There's very much so, like, I do highly value this resource, but I don't value this resource. And that oftentimes defines political parties. And it's quite funny from a philosopher's standpoint as an epistemological problem of like, well, how do you validate the knowledge aspect of all of this information and the consideration of how we even evaluate information? Because then you have people who say, oh, well, the again, vague, opaque circles, the left is primarily motivated by emotion and the right is primarily motivated by intellect. And you're like, well, I mean, okay, it's different circles and cycles.
Which emotions? Different emotions. They're both everything's really pretty emotional, really, if you get down to it. But it's just different emotions. People say men don't have an emotion. Like, why? Anger is emotion. It's I mean, anyway.
I think that part, that this idea that men don't have emotions is very, very gone. It's just men don't have emotions like women,
right? Exactly.
And even the other part is like there's the jokes, the memes about it, and I know you've made your condemnation of memes, but which came at a good time. The point being is there's this men do have they express things differently, very differently. Like, for me to tell my friend that my male friend that I'm proud of him is an extremely emotional statement. Where that both as the giver and the receiver, but it's not very overt. But I know that when my friend comes to me and says, buddy, I'm proud of you, I'm proud of what you've done, like, I feel it. It's definitely a feeling. I feel it in my heart, I feel it in my emotions, but it doesn't mean that feeling has to be physically manifested.
Right.
And so the idea to say that men don't have emotions because they do not portray them the same way,
right,
is such a shallow argument.
Yeah, it's like a psyop almost. Like, our ancestors wouldn't have recognized any of that. Like, I mean, the men who wrote all of the poetry in the world, basically, painted all the paintings and wrote all the poetry and whatever would say that that's absurd. It would just, I guess, happened in the 20th century, I think, where men weren't, we were supposed to pretend that we didn't have emotions, and it just became misunderstood because I think just because of the voice of women and also psychology and so forth, and this kind of therapy culture that we have, like men weren't expressing themselves properly according to women.
According to women, okay.
Yeah.
So would you describe therapy culture real quick, or this idea of like what you meant by that? Because I feel like I'm putting in two different terms at the same time.
Just, I mean, obviously, like psychology and people who are going to therapy, psychoanalysts and so forth, have had a huge influence on society.
Yes.
Like in a sense, starting with Freud and Jung, but then as that became kind of an industry, you have all these people who are commenting on how it's okay to feel, how it's okay to talk. Well, I always link it back, I guess, because my age, to kind of Oprah Winfrey kind of culture, where you'd always have therapists come on and say, like, this is how you should interact with people, and this is how you should talk, and this is it, like, this is what's healthy and this is what's not healthy, and they've just had a big influence on like kind of pop psychology, to the point where it's almost, it's difficult to differentiate between pop psychology and regular psychology to a certain point. It kind of runs together.
Yeah, it was a normative. It had a normative effect on the society, of saying, not normative as in what's normative, but like normative as in law-like effect on society in determining what was the appropriate way to act in public, and that was determined by people who perhaps took on a combination of scientism and this sort of pseudo-intellectual approach. Because the challenge that I would describe from that sort of psychology is overdiagnosis is the one thing, especially in concepts like PTSD. Like, you have a veteran who comes back from the war, the infinite wars now, whatever, and he has to sit and talk to a 21-year-old or 23-year-old college grad about her diagnosing him with PTSD, and he's not able to express to her that the killing was the easy part. The hard part was leaving the gunfight there, because at least there the world was normal, and now I have to come back to the United States and try to act like slights to my integrity are nothing of consequence, or taxes are this, or whatever. And so for her, she's thinking, oh, you saw something bad that I've never comprehended outside of a book, and now but she is somehow the authority over his psychology.
Right.
It's just that's a caricature. That example itself is a caricature. I think the issue was a little bit more of a ivory tower meets pseudo, or the ivory tower pseudo intellectual gains the power of the priest, and
Right.
the role of the priest as counselor, and in the role of the priest as counselor was extracted from him and given to the psychologist.
Yes.
In much ways, like the role of the preacher on Sunday was his role as the sort of moral presenter, and let's just give it in its best light. It's not to make steel man versus straw man, but his role was taken from him culturally, not by force necessarily, and given to the newsman. So the psychologist is now the counselor, and the newsman is now the priest, because the newsman tells you what to believe and how to believe, and the psychologist tells you how to cope with your belief. And you're like, oh well.
Yeah, and really, I mean, they're just administrators. I mean, you have people who are just, they've gotten what my dad never went to college. He's an electrician, but he became like an electrical estimator, was bidding on hospitals and all that kind of stuff. And he always has to deal with engineers who did their school and did the whole thing. And he's just like, oh, you got your sticker, all right. And and that's kind of the way. I mean, these some girl who got her sticker got a job to like evaluate these guys' heads, and that's what is the expertise there, unless I mean, and there's a lot of good guys actually, I think, who are kind of taking up that role.
I do agree.
I think in the veteran community, I mean, from what I gather, there are a lot of guys who are doing that, maybe through coaching. Coaching is kind of backdoor psychology, but because you can't say therapist because it'll sue you. But
yeah, coaching, counseling, and therapy oftentimes are addressing the same issue.
For sure.
And you can see that with the veteran community. You can see that with within different forms of like the church there's a resurgence within the counseling movement within, especially like the Baptist General Conference. I know, and so there's like, but you're seeing it around the world. You're seeing it, especially in the veteran community, of like, okay, we saw the era when all the nonprofits popped up, and a lot of them turned out to be bullshit, and now we're kind of, and so the suspicion is kind of run its course, and now we're back at looking at, okay, now how do we actually help one another? And it's a growing period.
For sure.
So if we were to go down this road and delve into your book Fire in the Dark, which is if I'm not mistaken, is your most recent publication.
Yes.
Okay. And that one is not necessarily an extension of the other three, because you've got The Way of Men, Becoming a Barbarian, and A More Complete Beast, which in my opinion reads a lot like a trilogy, and then you've got a standalone being Fire in the Dark. What it's been a little while since I've read this one, but I find it intriguing on how this book had an influence, in at least the way I was looking at it, on a resurgence of interest in myth as something more meaningful than just a fable.
Right.
And it seemed like it came around the same time you had let's call it an aesthetic shift, moved to Utah, adopted the solar language. And can you give me a thesis for Fire in the Dark one more time?
Thesis. I mean, basically it was that, which you'll disagree with, which is fine. But the thesis for this one is basically that we're at a point in history where we can see all of history. And we can see how one myth turns into another and how they influence each other in this interplay, this big scheme of things that happened, and how similar these stories are in the way that like people have talked about this in the past, but more from a lefty kind of like hug the world kind of way, like your Joseph Campbell's and so forth, where they look at comparative religions and they look here are these stories that keep repeating over and over again.
Yeah,
And
I have read Here with a Thousand Faces, and I thought the book was great, except for the last 3 pages were just kind of like, eh.
Oh yeah, I didn't even make it that far. I found it very Freudian, but like it's yeah, it's, and also didn't he teach? I think he taught it on like an all women's college too. Like but
nice. I know. I will bring that back up again. Go.
Yeah. But it's it just kind of seems overly soft, and also Buddhist influenced a lot.
Yep.
Is his vibe, like, but my idea with Fire in the Dark was like one of the most compelling parts of The Way of Men is this idea of the perimeter, because it's simple and everybody understands it. And people, especially people who've been in the military and the battle, they understand it very specifically,
intimately.
Intimately. Yeah, that's and the idea of like creating a fire and having this circle of light that literally separates the world of chaos from the world of order, which anyone who's done a campfire knows how that works. So it's this beautiful metaphor, this thing that we've been doing for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, that men all around the world have in common. Mm-hmm. And that's my project with The Way of Men was to like look at masculinity and say, hey, what do men all around the world? What is masculinity always and everywhere? What doesn't change? What's universal? And that's really what I try to do with Fire in the Dark, but I do it in a mythological way. Like, what are the way that men have idealized themselves into gods? And because I in the way I see it is that men kind of portray the best versions of themselves as gods. Like there's this unreachable, like almost platonic form of me at it performing different roles, and that's what a god is. And then I'm some half-assed version of that down the chain.
Okay, yeah, all right,
yeah. And so that's basically what I am. And I'm like, well, for people who people obviously if they have a religion that they're deeply invested in, that's a thing, and that's not going away, and that's part of who they are. And then, but there's a lot of people who aren't invested in that, and like myself. And my idea was to like, hey, well, let's look at all these big themes and put them together. And like, why talk about, I guess when I went, obviously I was practicing Germanic paganism for a while. That was kind of my big thing. Had land, did a whole bunch of rituals for years and years with a group, and then was doing it on my own for a while, and then actually it was a bunch of special forces guys. Actually, we're out one time. We had best ritual I ever did. It was really cool. But one of them bugged him. Everybody else was cool with it, but one of them was like, "Isn't this just Satanism?" And not from a religious perspective. It was just there were some aesthetic things that were in the mix, and I'm like, well, like he was wrong as far as my intentions were concerned. But I really looked at some other things. I'm like, well, yeah, why are we doing this, and this? Like, why are we surrounded by bones and death? Like, why is that what we're doing? And so I that's when I kind of started shifting away from that, looking at a bigger picture. I'm like, and also, why am I focused on this one pocket in history? Like this one pocket, like Germanic paganism. Okay, which the more then you dig into it, then it was obviously was created by. It was made to be a political document. Snorri created that was, and he was a Christian. And so there's all kinds of like things that maybe like let's not get too deep into this and make it like it's absolute truth. Mm-hmm. And most pagans, I think, know that after a while. But like, let's look at the bigger picture. Like, where did that come from? And where did that come from? And what's the chain of things? And then you start, then when you look into all the Indo-European mythology, and then and that's, I don't think that's isolated. It's only Indo-European. There's some guys who go down that path and they kind of want to make it the new Aryan thing. But
yes, I mean, it sounds, it may sound suspicious in some people's arena, but in some ways it's more respectful to be committed and wrong to some sort of understanding and belief system than uncommitted and semi-neutral. Like I find that more respectable in other men when they're willing to state what they believe mm-hmm. with some sense of conviction, Christian, religious, Muslim, or otherwise. And then, because those people are willing to actually have conversations about it. Whereas people who are sort of, well, I don't really want to talk about that, oftentimes are found out to not really having any genuine belief or meaningful conviction at all. And so the whole Aryan thing is like, okay, can you tell me where it's wrong? What's the moral, where's your moral impetus? What's your metaphysical foundation? What is your argument here? What is your, and then if you're willing to make that argument, then I can engage with it. But that also gives me a warning sign from a tactician sense of like, I think I know how you're going to move. I got to look for the movements and the actions of some people, right? It's the same thing that you see in like Minneapolis is when people start chanting Black Lives Matter in the streets. My suggestion is you close your business and you move to a different city.
Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that, I mean, what I meant by that specifically was that because this is what the Nazis did, was that they in the Rig Veda, there's a thing called Arya, and they're the Aryans, but they actually weren't right. Like it's a lot of confusion, but some people have cued in on the Indo-European thing as being like the secret white thing, and it's really not. But that's the only point I was making about that. But like going back into that well of myth, these things are connected in a lot of ways. You'll see things in the Rig Veda that you also see in ancient Greece, that you also see in the German stuff, and that you start to see these themes. And so Fire in the Dark was really about like capturing these themes. And instead of talking about Thor, why don't we talk about warriors?
Yes.
Like let's talk about the striker as being the idealized warrior, and what does that do, and what is his purpose, and what? Let's talk about that rather than this pocket in history. Let's look at all of it. And like this, we've been doing themes in this group that I run, the Order of Fire, and last month we did Native American theme, and I was super psyched that I found like what I felt was a striker comparative in the Apaches. Because that's what tribes were around where I am right now. Well, we are, I guess. So I looked into that, and so I'm always interested to find these parallels elsewhere as well. So that's basically the general gist of the book. I mean, that's a lot. That's not really a good elevator speech, but it's a big subject. But why it interested me, because I feel like there's a lifetime of work there, is to like build that idea out. Mm-hmm. I mean, actually, to be honest, there's a project. We have a good member of my group who's getting married soon. And then I was asked to create like some words, like what what would in our philosophy, what would work into his vows. And I'm like, oh, well, that's an interesting problem. And I don't feel like the best one, but I have another guy who's married and very happily married. And I'm like, well, what would you want to hear? You know, like how does that interfere? What would be the best thing to say? And so we went into that. And so like I said, there's a lot of interesting work that could be done.
Mm-hmm. So this, going back to the language of the striker, and this is where philosophy, theology, and then the violence side start interacting with each other, because my issue with Joseph Campbell's writing with Hero of the Thousand Faces is it starts very descriptive, but then he makes a very distinct shift into trying to make it prescriptive at the end. And the justification from that switch is either non-existent or extremely, as a man, like kind of disrespectful. Now, I didn't find the book itself disrespectful, but that's the impression that I get from a lot of that era of writing in regards to that sort of Buddhist-ish influence, is something that you see even reflected in other religious figures of that region. One of them particularly being, I think it was the Dalai Lama, who was saying, everyone can believe whatever they want to believe, because you'll just be reincarnated until you believe what I believe, and then you'll go on to nirvana. Which, like, as a human being, is sort of is kind of like saying, every belief is acceptable because they all end up as mine. Right. And you're like, that's very different than the all roads lead to Rome mentality, but it's also the same. Yeah. And I was like, and so what it sounds like is, it sounds like this kind, peaceful man talking about how, we're all going to live in some sort of harmony. But what he's ultimately saying is, everything that you believe will be conquered by me, by what I believe. And it's like, on the one hand, challenge accepted. On the other hand, you're not the kind person that people say you are.
What does that Christian say? Like, every knee shall bend, like something like that.
Yeah, I mean, there is the statement in the end of the Bible: every knee shall bow, and it's written in this language that they will either bow by will or by the shattering of their shins. And it's like, okay, so even so, and so this, as a Christian, there is something that is something to hope in, because I believe in this. I genuinely believe in this, right? And I find this kind of conversation really strange, especially amongst something that I don't know where it came from. But in the one hand, you can believe what you believe, because what I want most from you is genuine belief. And also I would want you to believe what I believe. But there is no point in me subverting your mentality through manipulative movements or disrespectful arguments in order to come to that conclusion. And so there, in a sense, there is no point in me, like, for me to say, oh, well, I'm a Christian, but I'm not like one of those, is very apologetic and not in the Greek sense. And I mean, like, Koine Greek, apologia mentality. But it is also the same thing. It's like, I respect you as an individual, that you will believe what you believe. And if we're going to have rapport with one another, which is what you got into, what I took away from The Way of Men, honor being rapport, and a cognitive understanding of that, then I can engage in that conversation. But you and I don't know each other well enough, and so maybe that's not the best way to start a conversation. It's just such an odd thing. Like, of course I want you to believe what I believe, because I think it's right. But does that mean that I can't talk to you about anything meaningful? Absolutely not. And so we go from Joseph Campbell, which starts descriptive, ends prescriptive, and then you've got Fire in the Dark, which I found broader. Let's just say a little bit more broad, and then less of that subversive twist at the end. But I am talking to you, so I'm going to couch my words a certain way. And the point that this comes into in the idea of the strikers, that in all of these religious attitudes, whether it's Christianity, Islam, whether it's just take any sort of pantheistic religion, especially anything including the striker, they do not describe justifications for violence solely on the act of self-defense. And our contemporary American or westernized culture, in some ways because of people like John Locke, but in some ways because of, I would say, cultural negligence, have eradicated the knighthood of the cowboy who goes out and does the good thing, even though it can be a little dirty, to the only time that I am allowed to do violence is when I'm in my home, in my underwear, sleeping in bed, when someone breaks into my house. And you're like, I've heard this story 1,000 times.
Yeah.
And that's not how we operate as rangers. That's not how we operate as men in business or anything else. And so I was curious on if you could draw in any of these observations of, I'm going to call them theological principles from this idea of the striker, on how your perspective on violence has changed from your very influential article written in 2010 called "Violence is Golden."
Uh-huh.
I know I was going to start here, but I think it's like we get there. So
Yeah. Well, violence is golden. It's still right. Like, it's probably the most popular thing I've ever written as far as being shared and so forth. Because I think it was really supposed to be part of the way of men.
Okay.
Because I really didn't feel like I could talk about the way of men without this underpinning of this understanding of violence. I thought it was necessary to get into. And then it kind of interrupted the flow of the book to put it there. I actually put it in the hardcover at the end and said this when I put it out at the 10th anniversary of it. But because they do go together in a way. Like you have to understand what the purpose of violence is, and the fact that violence doesn't go away, it just changes hands. It's like what is that? Like energy does the same thing, right? Violence doesn't really go away, it just changes hands. Like it's like if in a non-violent society, it just means the state has all the power.
Okay. That helps with the explanation.
Yeah. I mean, so I still think that's true. I mean, that's undeniably true. It's like they want to take everybody's guns so that they have all the guns, and I mean, absolute authority, and so I think it's just that was really a good essay because it was really easy for people to understand, like and connect with that in a way that maybe wasn't as was accessible to people. And so I don't think that my opinion on violence has changed. It just because it also kind of includes the idea that there's good violence and bad violence, and maybe there's a perspective that's a perspective thing, because that good violence tends to be tribally oriented, like it's good for us. It tends to be kind of how that works. If you talk about all these mythological figures and so forth that we're talking about, all these people, like in the Rig Veda, we've been studying this the past week, so it's kind of in my head. Constantly praying to Indra and Agni and all the other gods for victory in battle. Yes. Constantly, like that's what they prayed for more than anything else, was victory in battle. We want to be strong. We want to be glorious against our foes. We want to be able to take wealth. Basically, like they're actually talking about really raiding. Like if you looked at it in a certain way, to go take wealth, which is not defense. It's we're going to take wealth from the godless people.
Okay, so a contemporary mythology, and not myth, but still a novel, would be Lord of the Rings, right? And the men, the characters in the Lord of the Rings, we'll just use the movies. Never attack until the very last scene. They're always moving to defend something. If you're looking at the war side of it, unless you're going to count moving the ring in there to be a form of attack, because I mean, honestly, it does destroy the Dark Lord, so you could make that argument there as well. Like they were preemptive in their striking by terminology, but this idea, but their mentality throughout the entire novel and book is never, we're going to go take the Dark Lord's stuff. It's always, well, he was actually a threat before, and so they're still responding to a threat. And I find that very common in the 20th century, but I don't find it very common across history, because every major, whether it's the Ottoman empires and the Islamic empires and everyone who's expanded, has had some form of a speech, including A chaplain who was Strucker, who talked about how, you know, praying that God would give the soldiers like supernatural aim kind of thing so that we defeat our enemies. And so it's like just I don't know. I don't find this passive reactive mentality sufficient as far as an ethics base anymore.
No, and I think we've been talking a lot about a buddy of mine and I have been talking about like the magic and the creation of laws and like what that you know eh, he traces it back to ancient Greece where you basically you they decided law used to be justice used to be about vengeance,
Yes.
and then at a certain point it became about law. Like law took over vengeance, and so it became like this is a different thing that isn't vengeance, but you should be satisfied with it. And the law then kind of oversaw all that rather than it just being a cycle of violence, which is what like one of the reasons why we created laws, because you have generational feuds. But it yeah. Anyway, it creates it's an interesting rabbit hole to go down. Like as far as like where this starts of us being aggressive. If you're going to live in a society that has rules, obviously I can't go to my neighbors and be like, "Hey, I want to go raid my neighbor."
Absolutely not. Yeah.
Is not going to work in a civilized society. And to a certain extent, the 20th century, then you run into nuclear power as well, which kind of throws stuff off. Like the whole idea that countries used to have, like we're going to become a great empire by going and killing a lot of people and taking their stuff. We don't have that really anymore because you start a third world war and like there's all these chain of events that happen after that.
But we have regime change, and we do the same thing through insurgencies. We do the same thing through.
They frame it different. Like that's
that's
what you're talking about, really. Like you're framing it as we had to do this. This was necessary for like in the way that they're doing Ukraine and shit like right now. Like we have to do this. But Putin's a bad guy because he's an aggressor, and we're the defenders.
But there's a distinction there because there is the distinction between what you tell the public and what your intentions are.
Oh, for sure.
Because so like for example, let's take any sort of special operations raid. So Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Delta Force, whatever, going out to go, or ground branch guys from CIA, whatever, go out to do some spook stuff, to go eliminate a target, whatever it is, right? Now, the justification is only really important to the public if they know it happens, which lives in tension with if the public knows that the Navy SEALs are going to go take out bin Laden, a bin Laden sympathizer is going to tell him, hey, bro, move houses. So there's this, or someone could set up an ambush, or there's all these multinational, multi-angled conflicts going on at the same time. But when a person in some position of authority is in a position to make these kinds of decisions that involve things like regime change, I don't know if it's safe to assume that their motive that they believe is the same as the motive that they present to the public.
Yeah, I mean I feel like you almost have to be childlike to think that they're not, like people are not thinking aggressively in positions of power. I mean, clearly, if you still believe that there's benevolent rule after the last like 3 years, I don't know what to tell you. But it's I don't think that any of those people were benevolent in any way.
I don't think that those people were benevolent, but I think that there is benevolence. It's not impossible. It's not impossible. It's just that it's certainly not present in these people.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I would love to believe. I mean, that's the worst black pill that you could possibly have, is that no one in power has ever been benevolent ever.
Yeah, the all power corrupts.
I would
argument.
love to not believe that, and I'm not going to go down that road. I don't want to believe that. Like I hope that that's not true.
I think that there is an ethical it's sort of like it's sort of like a straw man. If you're going to say the idea that all power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely is still a cheap answer, because it's like it's asserting an assumption that we can see how power corrupts people, but it is then essentially a straw man of saying, anyone who holds authority is thus therefore corrupt. And then you get Marx, and then you get, you know, a binary metaphysic of oppressors versus oppressed, and then you end up with, you know, all of that kind of pseudo intellectualism that pervades the academies and so on and so forth. So and I think it's, we're approaching a time in especially culture and society, especially as men, where as much as the term the manosphere might get attacked, there is a difference between charlatans and genuine presenters.
Yeah.
And you find that in any example. And this is where I still go back to this idea of, I'm going back to this question on violence, because the way that you wrote violence is golden could very easily be interpreted as a generic might makes right argument. And what I mean by that is a very, very childish, like, well, history is only written by the victors mentality, which is not true.
No.
It's not only written by the victors.
Right.
That's just, it's sort of like blaming the education system for you never reading and you're 55. It's like, well, you've got a library that you could have gone to, but you chose not to.
Right.
Well, they didn't teach me when I was 8. Well, bummer. You know, you had 40 years to solve it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I think if you really read Violence is Golden, I don't think it actually does read that. I think that's the way people would look at the title and think that. But like, I think that it, if anything, I see it as a warning against governments having too much power. You know, in the sense that they will use it. You know, that's how the world works. Yeah, that's what I see in it, at least. But yeah, I mean, obviously the might makes right thing. You can go all the way with that, including, I mean, I've read the book, which is, you know, super verboten. But you know, it's a fun book, but unfortunate language in some of it. But yeah, I mean, that's a simple, again, that's kind of, yeah, like you said, that's kind of a juvenile attitude.
Yeah, would you be willing to explain some of your philosophy behind the more complicated version of it, or the more, let's just call it the more thorough version, the mature version of understanding this? Because I still think it has a lot of relevance to our day and age to be able to look at something like that with a sense of intrigue. And I'll use it the opposite as an example. I believe that there are two forms of pacifism in this world. There's strong pacifism and there's weak pacifism. And strong pacifism is an acknowledgement and willingness to accept the consequences of that belief, whereas a weak pacifism is something like a false moral high ground that abdicates the responsibility of one's existence to other people's actions. And so the example of the first is that even though they're attacked, they will not defend themselves and they will not call on others to do it for them. Whereas the second will claim a pacifist and then hire somebody else to do the job for them.
Right. I think I'd agree with that.
Okay. And so in the same way, I think the generic might makes right, not to the victor goes the spoils, but a generic might makes right, as in history is written by the victor mentality, is that weak form of understanding the subject. Whereas I think there's something stronger underneath it, and I'm using weakness and strength as a binary, not as an accurate descriptor. Would you be able to elaborate on the second?
If I can, yeah. I mean, if I see where you're getting at it with it, I mean, it's like in the sense that violence is always part of life, and that it does underpin all laws and all rules, and you know, like without violence, they don't mean anything. Obviously, that's not the only factor that's concerned in anything. You know, like it's not just who has the biggest stick wins. There's a lot of other things in society that actually matter. You know, and I would prefer not to, you know, just be on the page of, you know, like whoever has the most guns wins. You know, I think there's, you know, obviously room for negotiation. There's room for other things, and room for ideas, which obviously very influential in, you know, choosing how violence is used and where. I mean, we were just talking about you know, the ideas of violence being defensive only. I mean, that's a world of ideas that have influenced violence. You know, like that's boundaries that have been put on it because of various consequences for using violence and so forth. I mean, it's a discussion that's obviously been happening for a long time, and just a realization of the changing of the playing field. Like in terms of like the world got a lot smaller in a way, and it's much more interconnected. I mean, like, you can't just, run over a few hundred miles, raid the village of the people there, and nothing will ever happen because you just run 100 miles back. That's not real anymore, because then the media captured that, and that's, like, there's all kinds of other things that are going on. So you have to be able to, I think, justify your actions in a different way if you want to be seen in a particular way.
The consequences of let's just call it casual violence are much higher.
Yes.
But that also, I think the effect that's had on how especially fighters, warriors, men and men in general have thought about violence is that they have begun to abdicate the moral side with the can I get away with it side. I think they've started to abdicate, is this right, for will I get away from it? And I'll use an example where, and I don't think that it is now. I think this has been going on for some time. My grandfather was a very violent man. And not all of the violence that he did, because he was in World War II, he was in Korea, he was a prisoner of war in Korea, and he also engaged in, let's just call it, extra legal violence in various scenarios, various events that now he's long passed, and now I am, as his grandson who went to war, has to look at these questions and his actions and try to consider them. His in some ways, his motivation was this is the right thing to do, but his justification was that he could get away with it. And his moral, I'm sorry, well, maybe it's the other way around. His justification, his moral justification, was that this is the right thing to do. They had a commander in the military who was stealing food or something like this. There was a person in his unit who was causing problems that were costing lives, and so during a gunfight, he killed this person so that no one would see in the chaos. But at the same time, his timing, his choice, his tactics was determined by, well, I'm going to wait till the enemy attacks, and then I'm going to run over and shoot him in the back of the head, or whatever his motivation was. And I don't, the story's kind of forgotten the story for a little while. And so he had this explanation of, well, no, I was going to get away with it. And now you look at it in our era with greater surveillance and greater technology and all these other kind of things. I think that I see a lot of people rejecting the abdication of morality for lack of being seen, caught, whatever. And I think we're trying to reject. At least I'm rejecting that. I don't think people choose to commit violence simply because of the convenience of the moment. I think that we make a pretty hard distinction between two different applications of violence.
I mean, I would definitely say that there are people who do that. But
sure.
I mean, I think there are a lot of men of criminal persuasion and like who probably do a lot of things because they're like, no one's watching.
The knockout, the knockout game,
yeah.
Right? It's I'm going to run up, I'm going to knock this dude out, and my friends are going to think I'm cool.
Yeah.
And in some sense, you could write a moral code that being cool by your friends is their moral objective, but I don't know if it's beneficial or fruitful.
Not for society as a whole, and like all those kind of intertribal moralities. That's the tricky thing about tribal morality, is that then it doesn't have to actually square with anything else. But it's for if his only tribe in the world is his little street gang, they say it's okay. So like it's moral in their world. Now, yes, whether or not we the rest of agree with us, we all have to live with them in the same society, and that's a whole different discussion. But that's kind of what tribal morality does. In the becoming a barbarian kind of way. I mean, like that's like if you're in a motorcycle gang, all the guys in your gang, if you do what they want you to do, you're doing something moral. really. I mean, that's their morality is what you've signed up for, and
Yes.
so that is that. Now, is that necessarily a universal good, or is it good for the rest of society, or whatever? No, but they don't care because they're tribal. You know, that's just what happens with morality and tribalism.
Yes. Well, morality doesn't survive tribalism, but that doesn't mean that we don't try to understand it. Like,
Right.
and so the example of the motorcycle gang, or the example of, where was I going with this? The example of some people don't commit violence because they're afraid of getting caught. It would be the inverse of of this effect, where I would go. It's almost like the braggart. Like, I would fight you, but I don't actually want to pay the price for it. Like, we call people like that a coward, or
Right.
someone who is very, very angry at their neighbor, but won't do anything about it because they know they'll get caught.
Well, I mean, I think that's very much a good example that everybody knows about because it's in the media recently. Is obviously that guy who strangled a guy on a subway.
Mhm.
Like in New York, was that the right thing to do? Probably. Like, did he do it? Yes, because it was probably the right thing to do. But that obviously they're going to make an example of him and make it a deterrent that no one else should do the right thing, and that's kind of the society that we live in. I mean, it's like if you're having at this point, we're ruled by lawyers in a way that we haven't been in the past. Whereas, you could, I think, if that would have happened in certain places in Texas, everybody would have been like, that was right. Good job. But not in New York. And if you do that in New York, you're playing roulette. And so they, yeah, they, like when people pretend that the law isn't there and that doesn't affect people's choices. I mean, I don't think we can't go by cowboy rules in 2023.
Well, that
Like
yeah.
he insulted my honor. You don't get to go shoot that guy because that's not how the law works right now.
Yeah.
Like,
Or just and then insert any of the post-apocalyptic fantasies. They're not fantasies about the outcome of the world. They're the fantasies of, there's no one to rule over me. I can make my decisions myself.
right.
Rule by the sword kind of thing.
Yeah.
And
That's a very popular male fantasy.
and sometimes it feels more close to home. I mean, there are environments that you can enter yourself into that live closer to that code, but you have to be willing to pay the price. And if you're not, then it'll eat you out, or not eat you out. It'll eat you up. There you go. Clip that and make me embarrassed.
Well, I mean, obviously, like cartels would probably be like a little closer to that world. Um,
Cartels is probably the closest American understanding, but if you go anywhere, you go a lot of other places in the world, you get the sense of adventure, but you might die in the desert, and that's a very big difference. That's a very big difference from where I'm at now to where I lived at a year ago, which is there's just a small hair of it, but there's just enough where you can see it, that there's more willingness of the individual to solve the problem themselves here, instead of to wait for some authority to do it for them.
Mhm.
And sometimes sometimes that justice sounds an awful lot like, there's a lot of big empty mine shafts around here, so let's be civil. Like, you're out in the desert
Right.
doing things in the desert. You don't have cell service. You're not just gonna, like, you don't have the affordability of just saying, well, I'm right, and I'll call the police. It's like, dude, none of that matters out here. You're not going to be able to call them for 30 minutes.
Right.
And I've got zip ties and I've got zip ties and a hatchet in the truck. Let's just not, like, be dicks about this.
Yeah.
And there is the threat of violence there, but people don't talk like that to each other. We're respectful.
Right.
It's just it's not a caricature of that world. It's interesting how that undergirds certain things, though.
Mhm.
Well, we've been going on for about an hour and 20 minutes, and so I want to make sure we have some window to kind of close in what this conversation has been going on, because I've enjoyed it. But um I think I had one final question and one final subject, just to kind of wind it down on. But I honestly don't remember it anymore. I've been so like maybe over amped for this. So, but I did have one. Maybe the more important question is, should people who read Fire in the Dark, are you working on something to follow up on that question, on that book?
On that book? No, what I'm doing in terms of Fire in the Dark is building this group that I have, okay. The Order of Fire. I have a bunch of guys, and like I said, we're sitting there talking about like, how would you write a marriage vow today, and studying a lot of these things more deeply, and really building out those ideas, because I think, I've seen ideas in the way that they capture people. From the best example I always use is from Germanic paganism, is that all military guys love the god Tyr. And I joke about it because it's the guy with one story. Like, there's only one story about the god Tyr, but the story is that he puts his hand in the wolf's mouth to basically render all the god's acts legal as they're tricking the wolf, and then of course loses his hand. Mm-hmm. And so he's like this metaphor for duty and honor and self-sacrifice.
What was the name of the Roman who did that same thing? He stuck his arm in the fire.
Scaevola.
Yeah,
I might be pronouncing it wrong, but I think Scaevola, like SCAV. Yeah.
He's captured by the enemy, and they're like basically threatening him to give away where the other men are, and they're threatening to torture him. So he like throws his hand in the fire.
Puts his hand in the fire and says, "See how many men would like. There are many men in Rome who would do the same thing."
Exactly, right. So there. I mean, there is the if you even if we want to bring up the joke of the meme, but it's relevant now. It's like, how many men dream of that day where they get to turn to their loved one and say, "Go without me. I will hold off the horde so that you may live." Right. Like, not all male fantasies are. Not male fantasy itself is not just a negative tone.
No, not at all. In fact, it's the world I live in. It's 3/4 of what my work is about. I mean, honestly, the big project that I'm working on now for Fire in the Dark, I mean, it's related to Fire in the Dark, but I think it has a bigger idea. It's a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but I'm pretty excited about it. I wrote basically a big, like, I'm pretty good. If you've listened to me narrate, I'm pretty good at doing Maximus speeches. Call it Maximus 300 speeches, whatever. Band of Brothers is what they really all are. They're all the same. And I wrote a speech like that, as in which I call it's a call against a dragon that's actually named Negation, that stands in for nihilism. And so it's a conversation between nihilism and basically vitalism, really. And so it's all this philosophy packed into this, with kind of some imagery pulled from the Rig Veda and so forth. And so it's this big speech that I'm giving really to men. It's the speech that I want them to hear. And so I have a friend in Sweden who orchestrated it, like with like Hans Zimmer type stuff. I mean, it's not quite like Hans Zimmer. It sounds a little bit like Dune too. It's cool. And then it's really
I think
awesome.
Dune was Hans Zimmer. Dune was Hans Zimmer, wasn't he? The newest Dune
movie?
Yeah,
you're right. It is. Yeah. He's done so many things that have so many different flavors. But you're right. It is. Anyway, so it's he went and scored that, and I went into a studio and actually recorded it, like professionally, and had it done right. And in 3 weeks now, I'm going to go into a studio with a green screen and actually make a video for it. And I'm basically making a scene from a movie that doesn't exist.
Exciting.
Yeah, it's super fun, and the song's done now. So when I listen to the whole recording of it, I mean, it's like 4 minutes or so, and it gets me stoked. I'm excited about it. So that's kind of my big project that's going to come out whenever we shoot this and they get it edited. But that's something I'm looking forward to a lot.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask one more question, and if you think it's best to leave it unanswered, I'll kind of yield that to you. But it is, within one thing that I observed is I got out of the military, and everyone talks about you lose that sense of camaraderie, and everyone's hungry for that.
Yeah.
And then I discovered that that same feeling was present in men who have never been in the military, is that they had this longing and sometimes a nostalgia that for a history that never existed of being in community with a group of other men.
Mhm.
And then the gun culture recently has reinvigorated that conversation. When I say the gun culture, it's extremely broad, but that so much so that the gun culture, the gun community itself has so much weight placed on it as in a desire. Men want to be in community with other people with similar values. And you started the way of men, talking about the way of men is the way of the gang. And then you went out and did it. And then as we were talking about becoming a barbarian, you said you started talking about things that you learned along the way. What is, if you're going to give advice for men who feel lonely, not lonely like the silly memes and the joke, the Korean pop star thing, whatever that is. But I mean, like they don't feel lonely for companionship in marriage. They find themselves lonely for what we once talked about as tribe, or talked about as gang, or talked about as community now.
Mhm.
What advice would you give from your life to those men? And women are going to be naturally included in it, but we know that most of gun culture is consisted of men.
Yeah, I mean, just because I tried it and it didn't work out doesn't mean it's wrong. You know, like I do think men are looking for that, and they're looking for some kind of camaraderie, and they're looking for a group of men. It's really hard to create in adult life. They Because people have schedules, they have spouses, they have kids, they have all kinds of stuff. Getting dudes to get together and meet once a month is a real challenge for a lot of people. But it can be done. I've seen groups of guys form all around the world. I just, especially with young guys, I mean, it's a little easier. We have literally last week, um, which is kind of flattering, but two separate groups in Australia of young men had formed up, and they invited guys from my group in Australia to get together and have the Striker Games, in which they all like wrestled each other and shot arrows and did all kinds of stuff, and you know, live the dream. They're actually living, you know, it's like 4 or 5 guys in college, and they're living in the same house and creating this environment for themselves, and it was really cool to watch and see. And so you can do that, especially when you're young. It's easier when you're young, but that's why, as an adult, I tend to steer guys toward jiu-jitsu gyms are another good place where you're going to meet guys who are kind of on the same page about a lot of stuff, and you know, have that kind of interaction that men don't have, but they need to have on a regular basis. They need to have that push and pull and be challenged in a certain way, and it's a really healthy way to do it. That's, you know, that's kind of canned advice at point, because everybody says to join jiu-jitsu, but it seems to be one of the most productive environments, and also where a lot of younger and older men meet in a productive way, in terms of, like, you know, have an 18-year-old kid wrestling with a cop, you know, like, who, in a way that would not happen anywhere else, you know. So that's you know, like, really kind of positive male role models. So I think, you know, the attraction is like the dudes, and really I think a lot of the motorcycle gangs were guys who got out of the military originally, like in the 70s and stuff.
Very much so. Yep.
Yeah, they're all veterans, and we want that camaraderie. And then, so if you get a charismatic leader who never goes to prison, but the rest of them do, like, they get a charismatic leader who will, you know, like, say, hey, I can give you brotherhood if you sign up onto this thing. It's very, very attractive to men. And so, like, I would avoid I tend to avoid dudes who sell brotherhood, because that can be very manipulative. And so I think that's something to maybe, like, look at as a possible red flag. And not that there aren't good guys out there who create brotherhoods and so forth, because there definitely are. I've seen a lot of good organizations rise up where they've been really productive. Like Ryan Mickler has the Order of Man, and that's like 1,200 guys or something like that right now, all around the world. And I mean, they're mostly good guys. I've met a lot of them. And so very productive, trying to help each other live better lives and connect and so forth. It's best if you can have a local group, but that's hard to find. So I think that's, you can start online and build out from there. I think is one of the best ways to do it.
Well, thank you for that. I've been on multiple sides of that coin. In community with people. We moved recently, so there's a bit of a shakeup. But it is, I do appreciate that where you started. Just because I failed doesn't mean that it isn't true. Because I think I've been that person before, where I've tried this and it didn't work out, or it did, but it's taking time. I don't know where the story's going to end. I'm only in my 30s, but well, we'll figure it out. So let's close this up then. Where's the best place to find your books? Where is the best way for people to follow you? Where are you the most engaged, or would you like the most engagement? And then where would people look for this production that you're going to be producing that's going to come out in the next month-ish or so? This Maximus speech.
Well, I'm going to try and make it so that you can't avoid that. So I'm going to put that out on YouTube, I think, first, and do a live premiere and do all that kind of stuff. My website is jack-donovan.com. There's a mailing list that you can sign up for. I don't actually use it a lot. I just use it for big announcements like that. Or if I have something good to say, like an essay or something, because some people, they want you to hit the mailing list like 2 times a week. And I'm just like, I don't have anything to say 2 times a week. So then there's Instagram. I Start the World is my handle on Instagram. I've been doing that for a long time. And then Twitter is a new thing because I only joined after Elon Musk bought it. I just figured I'd get canceled off of there before anyway. So now I'm on there at PH2T3R, which is hard to remember, I know, but it's like the Proto-Indo-European word for father. Okay. And so I
was wondering what that was. Like, I figured out it was you, and I was like,
it's my kind of cool guy, like techno spelling of, because in Indo-European, there's an H2 is one of the sounds. It's just because it's all theoretical. But anyway, so it's PH2T3R is my handle on Instagram, and on Twitter, and that's really, Twitter and Instagram are kind of my biggest platforms, and I'm going to work on more things on YouTube. Probably with the Order of Fire, though, in the future, just because that's kind of where I'm headed, and that's what I need to build my thing right now. So that's kind of what I'm doing. Like my group is kind of where my focus is right now.
Alrighty. Well, then, in conclusion, though, from one man to another, thank you for the time that you've written. You've taken thank you for the time that you've taken to write these books. I think I, for one, have been edified, and I have had the encouragement of reading a book that I could actually wrestle with, as opposed to one that was trying to hold my hand. So thank you for that. And then for those who are still listening, thank you for coming along in this conversation with us, between myself and Jack here, on some of those topics that we find most meaningful between men, but are not easy to have in public. And so I hope that this has been an opportunity for you to gain something, a perspective, a conversation, a motivation, some semblance of courage to go out and build your communities and spend time with those who you do genuinely care about. And Jack, one of my favorite things that you said, even in a short, was stop asking for permission. So you don't need my permission to go do what you think is right. That being the case, if you want to support the show, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com. That's where that is where you support the channel financially, as well as I host conversations there on the subjects that end up on these podcasts, and otherwise, as well as you can go over to redactedllc.com, and that's where you're going to find our merch, which does keep the lights on. As you see, we've built the set, so we got to pay for it somehow. But all in all, thank you all for listening, and keep your hatchet sharp and your powder dry.